My name is Nora Kendall, and at 68, I thought I had finally earned a little quiet. I had worked more double shifts than I can remember, cleaned more hospital floors than I care to count, and raised 2 children on my own after their father died in an accident that swallowed our whole world in a single phone call. All I wanted, after 4 decades of pushing through, was a home where I could breathe again. That hope lasted exactly 3 weeks. On a cold Saturday afternoon, sunlight slanting across the hardwood floors of my brand new house, I was unpacking the last box of dishes when the doorbell rang. I remember wiping my hands on a towel, thinking it was my neighbor dropping off the lemon muffins she'd promised. I opened the door with a smile that froze hard the moment I saw who stood there. My daughter, Allison, was in a tailored coat she couldn't afford. My son, Derek, smelled faintly of last night's whiskey, and between them was a stranger in a gray suit holding a leather briefcase. "Mom," Allison said, her voice clipped and businesslike. "We need to talk. This is Mr. Harlan. He's here to help us make sure you're protected." The lawyer stepped forward and offered a rehearsed smile. "Mrs. Kendall, your children are concerned about your recent financial decisions. They'd like you to sign a co-ownership agreement for this property. For your safety." I felt something sink inside me, something heavy and old. I hadn't even finished setting up my bedroom, and already they were trying to claim the walls around me. I didn't invite them in. I just stared, the winter air biting my arms, and said, "Is that really why you're here?" What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. I didn't grow up dreaming of the life I ended up living. I didn't imagine I would spend decades mopping hospital floors or scrubbing the backs of wheelchairs in a long, echoing hallway that always smelled faintly of bleach and fear. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It pulls you forward whether your hands are full or trembling. And after my husband, Jack, died in that factory accident, I didn't have the luxury of breaking down. I had 2 children who still needed dinner on the table and someone to sign field trip permission slips. I remember the first morning after the funeral more clearly than the funeral itself. I was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the coffee drip too slowly, the way it always does when you desperately need it. And Allison came in with her hair tangled and her eyes puffy from crying. She was 16, old enough to understand what death meant, but still young enough to hope I would fix it somehow. Derek wandered in next, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, 9 years old and already trying to be brave for me. I placed bowls of cereal in front of them and forced myself to smile, pretending nothing in the world had shifted. Even though everything had, grief didn't give me space to breathe. Bills arrived in envelopes that somehow felt heavier than usual. The mortgage company didn't care that I had just lost my husband. The electric company didn't care either. So I took the first job that called me back, doing janitorial work at a hospital 30 minutes away. The hours were long and the pay was thin. But the building was always warm, and the night shift supervisor didn't mind if I cried in the supply closet as long as I stocked the carts on time. For a while, my exhaustion didn't matter, because I still believed my sacrifices were building a life Allison and Derek could stand on. I told myself they would notice the way I dragged myself through the door at dawn, shoes squeaking from the disinfectant. I told myself they would remember the nights I spent folding their clothes on the couch instead of resting my legs. But children remember selectively, and mine chose to forget the parts that weren't convenient. The first crack in our relationship appeared on a late spring afternoon. Allison was getting ready for a school concert, and I had rushed straight from work, wearing my janitor uniform because I didn't have time to go home and change. The collar smelled faintly of ammonia, and I tried to keep distance between myself and the other parents so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. I spotted her backstage when someone opened the curtain, but instead of waving or smiling, She looked away quickly, pretending not to see me. It stung more than I expected. I told myself she was nervous about performing, that she didn't mean it, that teenagers just act like that sometimes. But that tiny wound didn't close. It stayed open, quietly shaping the years ahead. Derek's drifting happened differently. He was sweet as a little boy, always slipping his small hand into mine as we crossed the street. But sweetness ages strangely when a child realizes their parent is tired and easily guilted. As he grew older, he learned how to ask for things with just the right mix of charm and pressure. "Mom, everyone else has one," he'd say about a pair of shoes I couldn't afford. "Mom, it's not a big deal," he'd say when I told him we needed to stick to a budget. Somewhere along the line, wanting became expecting, and expecting became entitlement. The day he jokingly called me an ATM, we were standing in the driveway of our old rental house. He'd asked for money for something, gas, maybe, or a new phone cord, and I had told him I didn't have it that week. He laughed, nudged Allison, and said, "Guess the ATM's empty today." He meant it as a joke, but jokes reveal more than confessions sometimes. Allison didn't correct him. She didn't even flinch. She just rolled her eyes and asked when dinner would be ready. I lay awake that night listening to the radiator hum, wondering when my children had stopped seeing me as a person. I could blame grief or adolescence or the kind of poverty that forces you to make uncomfortable choices, but deep down, I knew part of the problem was me. I had never said no. I had never allowed myself to have boundaries because I believed that good mothers, I thought, were bottomless wells. But wells run dry. The moment I realized this wasn't sustainable came years later, when I found myself mopping the floor of an elderly patient's room while she told me I looked exhausted. She gripped my wrist gently and said, "Child, don't let the world drink you empty." I smiled and thanked her for the kindness, but her words stayed with me long after she drifted to sleep. I thought of Allison calling me before work to ask for help with her car payment. I thought of Derek, insisting I cover another expense because he was between opportunities. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I simply stopped giving. That question frightened me more than an empty checking account. I didn't know it yet, but that single thought, the daring, dangerous idea that I could choose myself, was the first quiet brick laid in the foundation of the life I would eventually rebuild. A life my children believed they were entitled to control. A life they would soon try to take. I didn't change overnight. People like me don't wake up one morning suddenly brave or defiant. We shift slowly, in tiny, trembling inches, the way ice thaws along the edge of a lake long before spring has truly arrived. My shift began on an ordinary Tuesday, in the fluorescent-lit break room of the hospital, when my friend Ruth slid a cup of weak coffee in front of me and said I looked like someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. Ruth was 10 years older than me, retired from nursing and stubbornly unwilling to let anyone she cared about drown quietly. She'd watched me drag through shifts, watched me answer every phone call from my children as if my bones depended on their approval, and finally decided she had seen enough. She reached across the table, tapped my wrist lightly, and told me I needed to talk to someone about my financial situation. I laughed at first, thinking she meant a therapist, but she shook her head. "No, Nora, you need someone who can help you protect what you have left." She wrote down a name on the napkin between us, Amir Patel, a financial advisor she trusted with her own retirement. I stared at the name, feeling something between embarrassment and curiosity. I had never spoken to a financial advisor in my life. I barely understood my own paycheck most months, but Ruth insisted, and her insistence had the weight of someone who had lived long enough to recognize danger before it was spoken aloud. When I finally sat in Amir's office, I felt more exposed than I had in years. I held my folder of mismatched papers like a flimsy shield, aware of every wrinkle in my work uniform. Amir greeted me with a calm, steady kindness that immediately softened the embarrassment in my chest. He listened patiently as I explained my income, my late husband's modest pension, the house we rented, and the financial requests my children made so often it felt like a second job keeping track of them. He didn't judge me. That was the first surprise. The second was how gently he asked why my children had access to so many parts of my life. He spread my papers across his polished desk and studied them the way a doctor studies symptoms before naming the illness. When he finally spoke, he didn't soften his words. "You're vulnerable, Mrs. Kendall, and not because of your age, because you've never been allowed to prioritize yourself." Something in me bristled, a reflexive need to defend Allison and Derek, but the bristle died quickly. He was right. He suggested I create a binder, a detailed record of accounts, passwords, debts, and a written statement of my wishes, not just for emergencies, he said, but as a way to remind myself that my life belonged to me. I didn't realize then how important that binder would become. As the months passed, I followed Amir's advice. I met with him after shifts, learned about my credit, my pension, and the very real possibility that I could buy the small house I'd been renting for years. The idea felt impossible at first. Me? A homeowner? But Amir showed me the numbers, the programs available, the way my years of paying rent on time had laid a foundation I didn't know existed. One afternoon, after reviewing paperwork for what felt like the 100th time, he looked at me with quiet certainty and said, "You can do this." It was the first time in decades someone had said those words to me without expecting something in return. I didn't tell my children right away. I told myself I would once the sale was final, once I felt steady enough to withstand their questions. But before I ever signed the closing papers, the first real test of the new me arrived dressed as the old me. Derek called late one night, his voice warm and apologetic in a way that always meant trouble. He said he needed a small favor, nothing serious, just a credit card in my name so he could reset his finances. He promised to make the payments, insisted it was temporary, insisted it wasn't a big deal. Without thinking, I agreed. Old habits die harder than people. 2 months later, a letter from a debt collection agency arrived, addressed to me. $8,000. Missed payments, late fees, accrued interest. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the paper until the words blurred. When I confronted Derek, he sighed like I had inconvenienced him. He told me I shouldn't worry so much, that I had always been good for it, that he would pay me back eventually. Eventually. The words settled in my stomach like a stone. That night, I opened the binder Amir helped me create. I added the letter from the collection agency, my notes about the phone call, the date, the time. My hands shook, not from anger, but from something sharper, clarity. The binder felt heavier after that entry, as if it understood its purpose better than I did. I called Amir the next morning. He didn't scold me. He only asked what I wanted to do next. For the first time, I answered honestly. I want to stop being afraid of my own children. He nodded like he had been waiting for those words. He told me we would move forward carefully, step by step, building something stronger than guilt or obligation. He didn't say it aloud, but I could hear the truth beneath his voice. My life was beginning to shift, and my children would not like the direction it was shifting toward. Owning my first home felt both unreal and strangely quiet. The day I signed the closing papers on that little house, the one I had rented for so many years, I walked from room to room, touching the walls like they might vanish if I blinked too long. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, but it was mine. Mine in a way nothing in my life had ever been. I didn't tell Allison or Derek. Not yet. I kept waiting for a moment where I felt strong enough to say it without shrinking beneath their reactions. That moment never arrived, but life, as it tends to, created its own. The shift happened the year I met Evelyn Hart, one of the elderly patients I cared for on weekends. Evelyn had a wicked sense of humor and a sharp mind that sliced through any attempt at pity. She lived alone in a modest apartment filled with classical music and framed photographs of a life she had lived fully, even without children. I cooked for her, helped her bathe, listened to her stories of a world that existed long before I learned how to carry my own. As her health declined, our conversations grew slower, heavier. One quiet afternoon, she reached for my hand and held it as if anchoring herself. She said she liked knowing I was in the room, that my voice made her feel less afraid. I didn't realize at the time that she was telling me goodbye. When she passed, I mourned her gently, the way one mourns a tender chapter rather than a long story. I attended the small memorial arranged by her lawyer, expecting nothing beyond a final moment of respect. Instead, the lawyer pulled me aside and informed me that Evelyn had left me $200,000. I felt the ground tilt. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I told him there must be a mistake. He assured me there wasn't. Evelyn had no close family left, and she had written that I was the only person who made her last years feel like living, not waiting. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window while disbelief and guilt twisted together inside me. No one in my life had ever given me anything of that magnitude. I wasn't sure I knew how to accept it. When I brought the paperwork to Amir, he took one look and exhaled as if a door had opened he'd been quietly hoping for. He reminded me that blessings didn't always arrive wrapped in comfort. Sometimes they arrived wrapped in responsibility. He showed me what the money meant, a real down payment on a better home, one where I could age safely, without drafty windows and unreliable plumbing. The idea felt too big at first, but the more he explained, the more it rooted inside me like a possibility I had never dared water. Within months, after careful planning and more paperwork than I thought existed in the world, I stood in the driveway of a home worth $800,000. It was elegant, but not extravagant. Sunlit, but not ostentatious. A place where I could cook without bumping into the stove, where I could finally plant a garden, where the air felt like a future I had spent my whole life earning. I should have known the peace wouldn't last. It started with a picture. My friend Ruth had taken a photo of me standing by the front porch, laughing harder than I had in years. She posted it online in a small group for retirees, thinking nothing of it. But the internet has a way of delivering information to anyone determined enough to look. Allison found the photo first. She didn't call to congratulate me. Instead, she drove to Derek's place, furious and breathless, waving her phone as if it were evidence of a crime. She showed him the house on Google Street View and demanded to know how I could afford something like that. They pieced together the rest: county ownership records, mortgage filings, the address I hadn't shared. The night before they showed up at my door with the lawyer, they sat together in a diner booth, planning their approach. Allison believed I was being manipulated. Derek believed I was hiding money that should someday belong to both of them, together. They convinced themselves that stepping into my life so forcefully was an act of protection. But protection isn't what stood on my doorstep that day. After I refused to sign their co-ownership agreement, things escalated quickly. They claimed they were worried I wasn't thinking clearly. Their lawyer sent a formal letter requesting mediation, insisting this was the best path to preserving family harmony. I agreed to attend because refusing would only give them fuel for their narrative. At the mediation table, Allison spoke in a polished, rehearsed tone about my recent impulsive behavior. Derek added comments about my supposed forgetfulness. The lawyer pushed papers across the table like he was closing a business deal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I reached into my bag, placed my binder on the table, and opened it. Their talking stopped. I watched their eyes dart over the copies of debt letters, the notes I had written after difficult phone calls, the proof of transactions they had insisted I approve without explanation. For a moment, the room felt still, as if even the air had stopped to see what they would say next. Allison's face flushed. Derek's jaw clenched. Their lawyer adjusted his tie and shifted uncomfortably. The mediator asked if I wanted to continue sharing my concerns. I said yes. It was the first moment I allowed myself to speak the truth without softening it for their comfort. And it was the moment they realized I wasn't as defenseless as they believed. The mediator didn't resolve anything. He couldn't. My children hadn't come to listen. They had come to win. Within a week, I received notice that Allison and Derek were petitioning the court for a conservatorship evaluation. They claimed I was mentally compromised, financially reckless, and at risk of manipulation. Reading those words was like being stabbed by the very hands I once held steady while they learned to walk. The court ordered a cognitive assessment. I followed every instruction, answered every question, completed every test until my head throbbed. The doctor was kind, but even kindness couldn't ease the humiliation of proving that my mind still belonged to me. When she finished, she told me gently that my memory lapses were normal for my age and nowhere near the threshold of incapacity. The relief washed over me slowly, almost fearfully, as if trusting good news might invite it to disappear. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with my binder tucked beneath my arm like armor. Allison sat on one side, polished and tense. Derek sat next to her, avoiding my gaze. Their lawyer spoke first, painting me as fragile, confused, overwhelmed. He made me sound like a stranger to my own life. When my turn came, my attorney, Karen, stood beside me and asked me to speak. I told the truth, not dramatically, not angrily, just plainly. The way a wound reveals itself once pressure is removed. I spoke about the years I worked 2 jobs, the nights I went without sleep, the debts I paid that weren't mine, the fear that saying no would shatter whatever love my children had left for me. I told the court I was tired of being treated like a resource instead of a person. When I finished, the room was quiet enough to hear the hum of the overhead lights. The judge denied their petition immediately. His ruling was firm, almost stern, as he reminded Allison and Derek that conservatorship was not a tool for controlling a parent's autonomy. Their faces fell in unison, a matching blend of shock and something darker, fear of losing the grip they thought they had on my life. But the story didn't end there. Karen submitted additional documents from my binder, enough to trigger a separate investigation into financial misconduct. The inquiry uncovered forged signatures tied to an old loan taken against my previous house. Derek was confronted first. When he panicked and tried to pin everything on Allison, their united front crumbled. Charges were filed. I didn't celebrate. Watching your own children stand before a judge is not a victory. It is a grief all its own. Months later, after the sentencing hearings were over and the dust had settled, I finally moved into my quiet life. My garden began to bloom. I cooked in a kitchen that felt like safety. Some evenings, I still thought about the children I raised, the children I lost long before any courtroom. Loving them had cost me so much, but saving myself didn't make me loveless. It made me whole.